Hello, this is Daniel Dauphin with Dauphin Horsemanship, and we're here today to talk about correction bits. Correction bits have been brought up several times in the comments, and a lady on Facebook, Miss Tammy, had asked me a question directly about them, and so I thought that correction bits probably are well deserving of their very own video. So here is a video on correction bits, probably the most misunderstood of all bits, or certainly one of the most misunderstood of all bits. So let's break down the mechanics of it and how they actually function mechanically inside the horse's mouth. Back to our good old 7 pressure points of the horse's face that all bits and hackamores and so forth work on. A correction bit works on the tongue, the lips and corners of the mouth, and the bars of the mouth. Most of them do not touch the palate. We only consider a bit having enough port to affect the palate once we get in the beyond 2 inches range. And most correction bits are going to be an inch, inch and a half port. There are exceptions to that, but most, this is just a standard correction bit right here. Most of them are only going to, or not going to have enough of a port to affect the palate. And then because it is a leverage bit, it will bring into play the chin and the pole. So what is a correction bit? This is a standard correction bit. Typically, you're going to see that they're going to have copper on the bars of the bit. That's pretty standard procedure. They're going to have about a 1 to 1 inch kind of a medium type of a port. They're always going to have swivel shanks. And they're always going to have a double jointed mouthpiece, okay? And that's kind of what makes up a correction bit. So we have that name correction bit. In reality, this is just a ported, double jointed leverage bit. Now that doesn't sound so bad, does it? Not nearly as terrifying as something like a correction bit sounds. There are a couple of different ways. This is what I would kind of call the standard correction bit. Some of them have a tube welded here on either side, and the port is really just separated from the bars at the very top and swivels there within the tube. That really doesn't change how they work very much. At the end of the day, what really matters is the double jointed mouthpiece and how that affects the horse's tongue. So let's kind of get into that, the double jointed versus the single jointed, and how that plays out in the horse's mouth. Okay, so let's focus for a minute on the mouthpiece of the correction bit. This really isn't a very complicated thing, and I know I haven't done a video specifically dedicated on it, and it's probably warranted, but basically we're talking about the difference here between a single jointed bit and a double jointed bit, and then the change of the port in the double jointed bit versus something like a dog bone or a lifesaver ring, or you know, whatever type of lozenge would have been in the middle in the typical snaffle double jointed bit. So here we have a representation of the horse's lower jaw. These are the molars back here. We have the bit laying across the tongue in the bit groove there, and then the front teeth on the lower jaw. So this is how a correction bit would be lying in a horse's mouth at rest. And then this is sort of the, if you were looking straight up into the horse's mouth, this is what the tongue would look like. So this central portion here is meant to represent the tongue. The blue is the double jointed bit, and the red is the single jointed bit. So first let's look at what a single jointed plain Jane snaffle has been doing to this horse's mouth and tongue all along. I'm definitely going to add another video that I've done called the Nutcracker Effect. We'll put it in the description and link it to this video. That would be another good video to watch that kind of dispels what the Nutcracker Effect is. But a lot of people would believe, I'll just summarize, that when you pull back on both reins of a single jointed bit that you're forming a point, which is true, but that point is jabbing the horse in the roof of the mouth. That isn't possible to do. In order to form the point, you have to be pulling the bit down and compressing the tongue, which is removing it from the roof of the mouth. And there have been many studies where horses' mouths have been x-rayed with the bit in it and so forth that proves that it isn't possible to poke a horse in the roof of the mouth with a single jointed bit. What you are doing is basically forming kind of a triangle out of their tongue. So if you could, in each of these drawings where I have the heavy dark blackened in line right there, that is meant to represent the bars of the horse's mouth. And again, we would be, shooting the picture like this where you're looking down the long side of the tongue like so. So our single jointed bit laying on the tongue at rest in the horse's mouth, the tongue would be sort of an oval. As we would pull back on both reins, you would be sort of forming the tongue into a triangle. You're pulling down kind of just on the sides and mostly having bar pressure. For that reason, a single jointed bit is kind of the king of lateral bits. It has probably the most lateral to it of any design of bit, basically anyway, for sure. A double jointed bit, now this would be just a typical double jointed snaffle, laying at rest in the horse's mouth. It's going to more evenly wrap, so you can see how this is almost a three-sided figure. This kind of how that bit's going to lay on the horse. And as you pull on both reins evenly, you basically are just flattening the tongue until you get to the bars. For that reason, double jointed bits tend to not be as effective laterally, but they are more effective on vertical flexion, on getting the horse to drop their chin and break at the poll. A lot of people don't understand this. Double jointed and single jointed bits really aren't all that interchangeable. They kind of have different uses to them depending on what you are working on the horse with. I will also say, because a single jointed bit is, or double jointed rather, a double jointed bit is predominantly a tongue bit. It is, most of the signal it is giving off is going to be on the horse's tongue. So there's no tongue relief to them. And as I have said before, the tongue is the most sensitive organ inside the horse's mouth. So it is very easy to aggravate a horse with a double jointed snaffle. If you have a lot of contact and you're constantly messing with the tongue, it's very easy to get that horse into a sensory overload sort of a thing. In other words, with your hands, you're kind of screaming at him. You don't feel like you are, but he does, because everything you're pulling on, even with no leverage, is on the most sensitive part of his mouth. For that reason, when I see horses in snaffle bits that have mouth vices, particularly the throwing the nose up and all that, probably 80% of the time that horse is being ridden in a double jointed bit by a rider that is riding with too much contact. And so the first thing I tend to do is back them out and put them into a single jointed mouthpiece, and then back off a little and kind of let them kind of shake it off and relax and chill out a little bit and get rid of some of that sensory overload. You can then potentially bring them back into a double jointed bit, but the rider's gonna have to understand they're gonna have to back way off. You can still ride in contact, but contact should be nothing more than taking the weight of the rein off. You shouldn't be compressing the horse's tongue in contact. If you are a heavy-handed rider. So very common to see horses ridden by heavy-handed riders with this type of double jointed bit, with blue tongues or withdrawing the tongue, a lot of foam at the mouth because the mouth seal's being broken. Lots of those things are because of that particular union of heavy hands and a double jointed bit. I'm not particularly a big fan of a double jointed bit. I don't use them a whole lot. Vertical flexion is not something that I really have a whole lot of trouble getting into a horse, and to me, lateral flexion is far more foundational. So of the two, I'm going to spend far more of my time riding a horse, even over that year period I'm going to be in a snaffle. I'm going to spend most of my actual minutes in the saddle working on lateral flexion. Maybe only a third as much time will I be working on vertical flexion. So I tend to stay in the more lateral bit to help me out with that. Now when we get into correction bits and we throw the port into the mix, what we're essentially doing is adding a little bit of tongue relief. So you're going to make their tongue look kind of like a flying saucer, where you would have just pancaked it a little bit with the double jointed bit. With the ported bit, you're going to give them a little tongue relief in the center, so you'll form a little bulge in their tongue, and then you're going to have a little more pressure on the bars, and actually, if you get harsh with it, you can kind of pinch their tongue between the bit and the bar. Not a hard thing to do with a correction bit, probably part of where it gets that correction moniker from. We'll talk about usage of it a little bit in the later part of this video. So that's the main difference between a correction type mouthpiece and a typical double jointed mouthpiece. A correction mouthpiece actually has some tongue relief, making it a little bit easier on the horse. Again, people tend to think of these correction bits as harsh bits, and you know that's not necessarily true at all. I would say without hesitation that correction bits are probably the most used bit behind a snaffle bit in all of horse training. And if we think of time actually spent, you know, a lot of horses will ride their 2-year-old year in a snaffle bit. They'll ride in a correction bit periodically for the rest of their lives if they're in training. Every Western trainer I know of rides in them routinely. It's a very, very useful bit. Lots of trainers, including myself on occasion, move a horse straight from a snaffle into a correction bit and take them on from there. Now I would say that probably takes a little more skill than what the average person has, but it's certainly doable. I wouldn't hesitate to do that with a horse. In fact, if I could only have 2 bits in the world, there's absolutely no question, there's not even a close second option here. I would have a plain Jane O-ring snaffle and a correction bit, and I could get just about anything I want to get done with those 2 bits. Very, very, very seldom, and I can't even think of an example of a horse that I've ridden that didn't go pretty well in a correction bit. They just about all do. One of the things that trainers tend to really like about them, and why we tend to use them on green horses, is that they are mild enough that you can two-hand in them. And I know an awful lot of people, I get questions about this a lot, think that it's really, you know, when you go to a curb bit, you're stuck in one hand. Well, that's not true at all. When you're transitioning through and getting that horse broke to the curb bit and understanding what that bit's about and how they need to respond to it, you're going to spend a lot of time two-handing. And basically you're going to wean yourself off of the 2 to the 1, but you're still going to have to reach down at times and pick up on a single rein and kind of get your lateral flexion back and so forth. And correction bits really do allow you, they're that mild that you can ride them two-handed just like you would a snaffle bit and get your horse into that groove. Again, if you have competent hands. One of the things that I'll say here, this plays a really big role in how the correction bit is going to work. And I have a long video on leverage bits and all of the mechanics of them, and I'm not going to rehash all of that ground. But this tongue pinching capability that they have, where they can kind of mash the tongue between the bit and the bars. That can't happen until, or it won't happen with much force at all, until the curb chain comes tight. So if I'm riding a green horse in a correction bit, one of the first things that I would want to do would be to loosen up my curb chain, which is going to give my rein a lot more play, which is going to give my horse a lot more time to respond before it has the potential to really kind of grab him. Now, because of that grab, I can tighten this curb chain right before a show on a more finished horse that we're ready to go show, and I've got that bite available very quickly, so I can really tune that horse up and get him very, very sharp, or very subtle movements of my rein he's going to be in tune with. And that probably is where the name correction bit came from. There are loads of trainers that use correction bits to tune horses up and get them really sharp right before we go show. I've actually done some looking and some research, and I don't know where the name correction bit came from. I haven't been able to find that out definitively, but that'd be my strong suspicion. It's because so many trainers use them to tune horses up and kind of get them sharp. But again, lots of trainers use them as one of the first curb bits that goes in a green horse's mouth too. So it's really a bit that has a tremendous amount of versatility and range to it. You can really two-hand a horse, get them nice and soft. Because it does articulate, it does move at these 2 points. What that's going to amount to, as you're pulling back on the reins, that bit has the extra time to kind of collapse and wrap around the tongue and the bars and all, and that does equate to giving the horse a little more time to respond. When you get into a bit that's got a solid bar in it, it makes that bit act a little quicker, because that bit doesn't have that collapsing, that forgiveness to it. So that's really an area of things that's pretty misunderstood. Let's see, I have a little list of what I wanted to cover here. So Miss Tammy's particular question was about a horse that she had a couple of horses that rode in a correction bit, and in only that bit she was having trouble with both of those horses going into more of a roll curve posture where they were behind the vertical. My strong suspicion there would be that it is more the bit than the style of bit that's causing that. So remember that all bits are individuals, and the way that a bit balances, again, we did this in another video, so I won't spend a tremendous amount of time on it here. But you see, this bit balances very forward. So if I'm bringing up the reins back 3 inches, which is a significant amount of contact with a horse, that bit in about that position should have the horse riding on the vertical. If I had a bit that looked very similar to this, made by a different company, it might balance naturally in this position, which should have the horse on the vertical. And if I were to pull back on the reins a little bit, getting contact, that's going to bring the horse behind the vertical. So my suspicion is that the particular bit that she has is balanced in such a way that contact with it is what's causing the horse to go behind the vertical. I wouldn't say that having an overly flexed horse is something that I regularly see with correction bits. One other thing that could be attributed to, and I don't know the 2 particular horses she's talking about, but is simple training. So if I'm riding one right now that's doing this, and I have I keep 10 or 12 horses in training, about always have one in the barn that has been through another trainer and kind of has this problem, that gets either behind the vertical or gets way too low with their head. The simple solution is don't release in that spot anymore. If I have a horse that, let's say when we're backing, it's just starting to learn to break at the pole, it's really common for them to get low at that point, I'm going to be picking up with my hands, and I'm only going to be releasing that horse when they get their pole up above their wither where it should be. If I don't release down there, he's not going to stay down there. He's going to continue moving and roaming and looking for that spot. And I could even, if I had a horse that was kind of trained that way and he thought that that was the spot, like behind the vertical, if I had one that got back there, I would kind of rattle those reins and bump him a little in that spot until he did what we might consider push against the bit. Only I would have released and he would have found freedom up there in front. And through that repetitively, I can get that horse from behind the vertical to on the vertical or slightly in front of it. And I really do like a horse just a little in front of the vertical. I think about 5 or 10 degrees in front of there is a more athletic position. And certainly the horse's vision is better a little in front of the vertical than behind the vertical. And historically, behind the vertical is it's a new fad. It's not something, if you look at horses in the 60s, the 40s, the 1800s, the 1700s, the portraits and things that we have, you don't see horses behind the vertical in those. That is a new, terrible concoction fad that we've got right now, which is typical of people taking a good thing and perverting it to an extreme until it becomes something unintended and totally different. So that we're getting into usage here a little bit. One of the things that I do want to point out, I have a lot of videos out there on good mouth habits and the things that I'm looking for. I don't want to give anybody the impression that in the process of training a horse that you would never have a horse open their mouth or withdraw their tongue. And if you ever have a horse do that, it means that you have really crappy hands or that you're a crappy trainer. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. I routinely have horses that display those behaviors on a temporary basis. So in fact, like if I had a horse that was running through the stop and I needed to kind of grab him a couple of times and effectively sensitize him to the bit, I would expect that in those bumps, sensitizing him, he's going to show discomfort in his mouth. He's going to open his mouth, he's going to maybe withdraw his tongue, he's going to not want any part of that. That was the point. That was why I bumped him. I wanted him to have discomfort in his mouth so that he didn't do that to me again. Okay? That's training. Does it mean that he was in severe pain? No. There's way too much stuff out there about horses in pain and so forth. I mean, take this bit and put it on your arm and grab these rings down here and do that, even with a curb chain on. And you'll see that, even pulling pretty dang hard, it's not anything I would describe as pain. I mean, it's uncomfortable. I wouldn't want somebody to do that to me for hours on end, but, I was talking to you through it. You didn't hear my voice waver. I wasn't going, man, this doesn't hurt at all, right? It's nothing like that. So, horses need some discomfort from time to time. They're going to need that from your legs as well. They might need a bridle rein on the butt from time to time. So what I'm looking for when I'm describing those behaviors, a horse that is tuned up and is with you and is being obedient and accepting of the bit is not going to have the tongue withdrawn. They're not going to have a blue tongue. They're not going to have a foamy mouth. If I have a green horse that is still in the testing boundaries stages of the game, that isn't a finished horse, that isn't an obedient horse, that isn't a horse that understands what's going on yet. So it would stand to reason that there will be some points in rides and maybe some multiple rides in a row where we're going to have kind of an ugly mouth. But hopefully through the discomfort that I'm causing in that ugly mouth, we solve the problem and then we get to the obedient horse that is respectful and accepting of the bit. That's the point. Correction bit, fantastic tool to get all of that done. As long as you don't take that stuff to the point where the horse gets scared of the bit, you're good. Now, certainly, do I see horses regularly at shows and things that are scared of their bit? I absolutely do. And that's rider area and that rider error. And that is someone who took this principle too far and had bad timing or got emotionally involved and got mad and frustrated and took it out on the horse, and now they have caused a different and even worse behavior. You should never see a horse that's scared of the bit, but you might want to humble them with it from time to time. Remember about loosening that curb chain up, and that would go for any type of leverage bit. I know I've talked about that in other videos, but there are definitely times when backing off on that curb chain is a very advisable thing to do. Now, let's say we have a show this weekend, maybe Wednesday and Thursday I tighten it up a notch or two, again, to kind of get that horse a little more sharp, a little more tuned in and right there with me. But if my hands aren't good, it's not hard for sharp to become scared, and there's definitely a difference. I can most certainly look at a horse and see in their expression, their facial expression, particularly as the rider is working the reins, whether they're scared of the bit or not. You're not going to see that in a good hands horse. Okay, one other bit that I did want to bring in here, a couple of little variations that we'll say. So this is a standard correction bit. You will sometimes see, this is the basic one, sometimes you will see one termed a low port curb, and they really will barely have any port to them at all. So if this bit right here has a 1-inch port, this is more like a 1/2-inch port. You will also sometimes see a higher ported curb, and sometimes you will see what is, I kind of like to call it a chicken choker. I think every particular bit manufacturer comes up with their different names for things, but sometimes you'll see some kind of a spoon that is welded to and coming off, and I mean it could be in a variety of shapes and so forth. I've seen them in all three of those kind of configurations. That's just bringing the palate zone into it. That's going to tend to break a horse more at the pole and the loin. Not at all uncommon if you were to take a horse that was well broke to a correction bit like this, and then you went and put them in a bit that had more of a port, rode them for 2 or 3 days, you're going to instantly notice that horses stop getting a lot harder, and you're probably going to notice that horse sore in his loin for a few days, because it's really going to be kind of breaking him in the loin and really accessing that horse's power a bit more. That's kind of what we get when we get into the palate zone generally. One other, I don't know that I would call it a correction bit, but it's kind of at least in the same family, and some people may well refer to it as a correction bit. I know it as a hinged port. It would have more of a square port. And it is going to either hinge here and here, or right in the middle. And what that's basically going to do is give you a little more lateral, a little more shoulder lifting ability. So with this correction bit, because I can pull on one side and kind of collapse it, I can get pretty lateral with this. But I can't pull on one rein at a time and only affect one side at a time. I lose that ability with a typical correction bit. When I go to a bit, we change the hinge from down here to up here, that changes. These bits that are articulated up there, you can now move just one shank back at a time, kind of like you can with a typical single jointed mouthpiece, which gives you again more lateral, more ability to lift a particular shoulder if you have a horse that has that problem. So I would refer to that as a hinged port, but you might sometimes hear people consider that kind of in the correction bit family. I'm not going to argue with them, but anyway, I guess sort of in a nutshell, that's correction bits. They certainly have their time and their place within training. Again, they're an invaluable tool as far as I'm concerned, and just like all bits, they are nothing but a tool. You can take a hammer and build a school, or you can take a hammer and bash someone's brain in. Either way, it's not a hammer problem. If you really scare the hell out of a horse with a correction bit, it's the hands of the rider that were riding that bit, not the bit that is at fault. So, all right, that's correction bits. I hope that clears some things up for you. Thank you much.